Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are talking about lab lesson number 6, which is about the skeletal system. To ease us into the skeletal system, let's do a little bit of tissue review because we have that lab exam next week. I've got 6 different kinds of tissue up here. Actually, here, let's put numbers on them so you don't have to type. So we're going to number them 1 through 6. We primarily today are going to be talking about bone tissue. So there's 2 kinds of bone tissue that we have in the body. We have compact bone and spongy bone. I've labeled those numbers for you. Can you tell me in the chat which of the types of tissue, which of the pictures that we see up here, represents compact bone connective tissue? Which one of these is compact bone? Yeah, exactly. Tissue number 4 that we see down here, this is compact bone. When we talk about compact bone, the way you're going to recognize it is because of these tree ring patterns. So we're going to label those patterns. They have a special name. We'll come back to and talk about them more. But when you see these big dark spots, these black spots, and the tree ring patterns around them, that's compact bone. But remember that the body also has spongy bone. Which of the numbers on the pictures up here, which of those numbers is spongy bone? Spongy bone. Yeah, a few of us chiming in. Spongy bone looks very different from compact bone. Spongy bone has the solid bone tissue that we see here, and it also has these open spaces where you're going to see either the dark red like we see here, or also things like purple or blue. So spongy bone tissue is a sponge. It's got space. Compact bone tissue completely filled with bone. There is a type of tissue that all of your bones started as. So the fetal skeleton is actually made out of hyaline cartilage. And one of my pictures up here shows me hyaline cartilage. Which picture is hyaline cartilage? Yeah, so remember when we were talking about our different types of cartilage tissue, we said that hyaline cartilage tissue looks like deer tracks in the snow. So tissue number 3 that we see over here, we have these sets of 2 cells that are together called chondrocytes because they're cartilage cells. And they're on this light surface. It's either light pink or kind of white. Deer tracks in the snow. That's hyaline cartilage. We have other kinds of cartilage that have the big cells in them. So here's another kind of cartilage down here. Tissue number 5 is a kind of cartilage with these purple things in it. What did I tell you in class? Every time we see purple, what are we thinking? What does purple mean? I know this is the first time I'm not asking you to just type a number, so I'm making you type longer. Yeah, anytime you see purple, whether it's cartilage or whether it's just dense connective tissue, whenever we see purple, we're thinking elastic. So elastic cartilage is what I see down here with number 5. Elastic cartilage has the big pink chondrocytes and all of these purple fibers that I find around it. Elastic cartilage in places like the epiglottis, which is what helps to make sure that food doesn't go down the wrong pipe. It flaps over your windpipe and covers it to make sure when you swallow, it goes down the esophagus. That's elastic cartilage here. This one up here is my one final kind of cartilage. Tissue number 1 is fibro cartilage. Remember that fibro cartilage has the blue protein fibers, and it also has these pink spots that we see here. That's the cells, that's the chondrocytes. Fibrocartilage is in the skeletal system as well because it's in between the bones of your spine. So in between the vertebrae that we see in the spine. It also forms a thing called the pubic symphysis. that holds together the two halves of your hips. So fibro cartilage, the blue streaky one, hyaline cartilage, the deer tracks one, elastic cartilage, the purple one. My last kind of tissue over here is not a type of bone or cartilage, but I included it because I thought it kind of looked like my my spongy bone over here. Do we recognize what kind of tissue we're seeing over here in number 6? Any ideas what number 6 is? He was like, I was born to type. I got this. Yeah, we are looking at epithelial tissue over here on the right. Epithelial tissue is a kind of tissue that's made entirely of cells. So all of this pink stuff with the purple spots, those are cells. When I look at this slide, the open space that I see here is where there would be oxygen, because simple squamous epithelium is found in the lungs. So simple squamous epithelium, you see these little skinny lines of cells. These little skinny lines of cells are places where we could do diffusion, where oxygen comes in and out of the lungs. Hey, here's a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge for next week with the midterm exam. How we had these 6 pictures of types of tissue up here on the screen. And I asked you, hey, which of these is compact bone? Which of these is spongy bone? That's very similar to the kinds of questions I'm going to ask you on the midterm exam. So I'm going to give you multiple pictures of tissue and ask you, hey, which of these pictures represents the kind of tissue I'm asking you about? So it's a good idea to try to have different pictures kind of side by side. We talked a little bit about how you can use Google Chrome to look up images of the types of tissue. Would be a great idea to do that. Have 2 different browsers open. And in one browser, we have spongy bone. And in another browser, we've got simple squamous. In one browser, we have hyaline cartilage. In another, we have fibro cartilage, or we have elastic cartilage. So make sure we can compare them, because again, you're going to see them side by side on that exam. Let's dive a little bit more specifically into our 2 kinds of bone tissue. So remind me, you already identified this for me. Over here on the left, is this compact bone or spongy bone that we see here on the left? What kind of tissue is over here? Yeah, so I zoomed in really close on compact bone for this picture that we're looking at here. And you have the space in your lab packet to draw a sketch of compact bone. And we do want to go ahead and sketch it with as many details as possible, because we need to be able to identify some specific things on compact bone when we look at it. So let me get out my pen and I'm going to help us to label things. When we look at compact bone, the first thing that we always see is this middle part right here. This middle part right here is what's called the central canal. The central canal. You saw these big black spots all over the slide when we were looking at compact bone tissue. If the tissue that's on our slide was still alive, if that bone tissue was still alive, we would find blood vessels inside these dark spots. So the blood supply for my bone tissue is found inside these dark spots called central canals. The next thing that we need to be able to identify are these smaller black dots. So the smaller black dots, I see them all over the place. We've got them all over the place. These are little things that we call lacuna. Lacuna. Lacuna is the weird anatomy word for something. What I want you to think of, and what I want you to write down in your notes for yourself to help you remember, a lacuna is just a fancy word for a home, or for a place that my bone cells can live. Most of compact bone tissue is all calcium and it's collagen. But if you're a bone cell, you can't live inside calcium and collagen. You need a special place to live. So a lacuna is the special home for my bone cells. Remember that those bone cells are called osteocytes. So I put that word in the chat for us. Osteocytes, the cells that live in bone tissue. One other thing we need to be able to identify when we're looking at compact bone tissue, and that's all of these little squiggly lines that you see right here. The squiggly lines that go between the two lacuna that are connecting the lacuna to each other, or that help us to connect the central canal to these lacuna. These are things, I'm not going to try to write it, it's too long, but I'm going to put it in the chat for us. These are called canaliculi. Canaliculi. So little central canals. That's these things here. Canaliculi allow my bone cells to share nutrients with each other. So I see them going from the central canal to the bone cells and from each of the bone cells to each other. Because if I'm a bone cell that lives out here, even though I live far away from my central canal, I still need to be able to get the oxygen and nutrients. Those canaliculi, those little squiggly lines, allow me to do that. So on the left, we're looking at compact bone. We need to know those central canals, the big black spots, the lacuna, the small black spots, and the canaliculi, the little stringy things we see. Over on the right, you are seeing spongy bone tissue. When you look at spongy bone tissue, I've got a couple of new words. So the bone tissue itself is this solid pink stuff. That solid pink stuff is called trabeculae. Trabeculae. Trabeculae is a fancy word for beams. That's what it means if we translate it. So like the big wood that's in the roof of your house, for example, that's what a beam is. So trabeculae are little beams of bone tissue. Outside of the bone tissue, you see all the little spots out here. This is my bone marrow. And again, remember that sometimes the bone marrow has more of a purple color to it. Sometimes it's more red, but it's always on the outside of these trabeculae. We're not asking you to label it on your picture or know it for the lab exam, but I do want to point out to you that these little spaces inside my trabeculae, these little spaces here are also lacuna. They're also lacuna. Can you remind me in the chat, what did I tell you was the easy word for what lacuna is? What are lacuna? Yeah, exactly. A lacuna is a home. It's the place where my osteocytes, where my bone cells live. So we'll talk about this more in lecture in a couple of weeks, but I see lacuna, or I see homes for my bone cells in compact bone and in spongy bone, lacuna. So we have looked at microscopy, or we've looked at images of my tissues for compact bone and for spongy bone. Now we're going to look at a model that shows me the compact bone up close and personal. So the first view I see of this compact bone model is from top down. So when I'm looking at my tissue from the top, looking down on it. There are some things that we've already labeled before that we'll start with labeling on our model because we labeled them before. So see these places on my model where we have a white spot with a red and a blue circle inside of it. The white spot with that red and blue circle. These are the places that on my slide were the big black circles. Does anyone remember what we called those big black circles that we had on our tissue slide? I know, lots of typing. I apologize. Exactly. Yep, several of us chiming in. The big black circles on our slide were called central canals. Central canals. I told you when we were looking at them on the slide that the central canals were the places where we found blood vessels. So when I look at them, this in my model where the bone tissue is still alive, I can see those blood vessels. My red is my artery, my blue is my vein. So Anywhere on this model where you see a space with an artery and a vein inside of it, all of these little circles here are those central canals. We had the big black spots on our slide that were the central canals, and then we had those little black spots. On my model, they're little brown spots here. Remember that the little brown spots are those lacuna, or they were black on the slide, right? The lacuna. Now, there are lacuna all over the place on this slide, or on this model. Anywhere that I have these brown dots, all of these little things, all of these are lacuna. So I don't care where you identify the lacuna, they're all over the place. You can see them everywhere. Lacuna, the little spots that the bone cells are found in. One of the things that we didn't talk about as much with the tissue that we need to talk about now is that the lacuna, or the homes for the bone cells, aren't just arranged all over the place. They're not just a big mess. The lacuna for the bone cells are arranged in things called lamellae. So this fancy anatomy word lamellae just means lines. Kind of like how our houses or our apartments are found on streets. That's what the lamellae are for my bone cells. So you kind of have to add them in a little bit because they're not necessarily shown in dark like I'm doing here. Notice how I've got some lines of bone cells that are making these circles around my central canal. These lines of bone cells making the circles, these are called concentric lamellae. Concentric lamellae, meaning they're in a line, or they're in these circle lines around the central canal. When I see lines of bone cells, lines of lacuna that are going around my central canal, they're called concentric lamellae. When I see lines of bone cells like I see out here that are close to the edge of my bone, these ones out here on the edge are called circumferential lamellae. And I'm going to spell that in the chat for you. I'm not going to write that all out. Circumferential lamellae. Circumferential lamellae are found on the circumference, or found on the outside of our compact bone tissue. So how these ones are in lines, while these ones are in circles, that's the difference between a concentric lamellae in a circle or a circumferential one in a line. If I live in a circumferential lamellae, if I'm here on the outside of the bone tissue, I still need blood supply even though I don't have a central canal. And that's what this gray thing is that we see right here. This gray thing that we see right here is something called the periosteum. Periosteum. The periosteum is the connective tissue that wraps around our bones on the outside. It brings in the blood supply, so the oxygen and the nutrients, to the bone tissue, the periosteum. One other thing for us to label on this model, and that's something called an osteon. To help us with labeling our osteons, we need to do a little bit of word math. So an osteon is made out of two things. I'm putting it here in the chat. It's made out of a central canal and all of the concentric lamellae that are around it. So an osteon is a central canal, like we see right here. Here's a central canal, plus all of the circles of bone cells around it. This is one osteon. This up here, this is also one osteon. And perhaps the easiest to see one is this big one. We'll see it here from the side. It kind of looks like a wedding cake. This is also an osteon. So anywhere that we have a blood vessel with lines of bone cells around it, that's an osteon. So the way that you recognize compact bone tissue is because compact bone tissue has osteons in it. That tree ring pattern you see, That is an osteon. In addition to knowing structures from the top of this bone model, we also need to be able to identify some things from the side. Some of these things we've already labeled and we're totally comfortable with. So remember, we've got these little brown spots. Can you remind me again in the chat, what were these little brown spots called? What's the little brown spots? Exactly. Yep, my little brown spots are all the lacuna. We have lots of lacuna. You can label any of them as lacuna. We also see on our model here that we've got this open space. So this open space that we see here that goes straight up and down, this is where those blood vessels would be found. So the blood vessels are inside places called the central canals. Central canals. We already know about those. So the ones that go straight up and down, central canals. What we don't know about, or we haven't talked about yet, are these ones that we see here going sideways. The ones that are going sideways, this is a type that are called perforating canals. Put that in the chat because that's long. Perforating canals. Perforating canals go at an angle. So the ones that come from our periosteum here on the outside, the periosteum out here, and bring the blood vessels into the central canals, those are perforating canals. Same deal with here. From the central canal, or from one central canal to another, we use a perforating canal to go that direction as well. So central canals up and down, perforating canals at an angle. You can also tell from this side over here, like I mentioned, this over here is an osteon. So you can see all of those concentric lamellae, the levels on the cake, the concentric lamellae that are here. Was there anything else we needed to label on this model? I forgot to bring my printed worksheet with me today. Did we hit everything? Perfect. Shelby says yes. Any clarifications that we want to get before we move on from the model, or send me an emoji if you're good. Thumbs up, or feel free to ask a question. Good, lots of thumbs up. I love Shelby bringing in some Finding Nemo. We do love Finding Nemo in my house. Yeah, so Dusty's asking a question because you have some functions to fill in. When we talk about the pathways that my osteocytes can use to share nutrients with each other, that is correct. That's the function of my canaliculi. Those little spider web lines. We don't really see them on the model, but we do see them, remember, when we were looking at our tissue here. So that's the goal of those, to allow them to communicate and allow them to share with each other. That's correct for those canaliculi. All right, well, we've talked about bone tissue up close and personal. We're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about bones big picture. So I've got an x-ray up here of the hand because there are several different types of bones that we see in the hand that help us when we're talking about classifying bones of the body. So let me switch colors here. One of the first kinds of bones that we have in our body are bones that are longer than they are wide. Bones that are longer than they are wide are called long bones. Now, we have some typical long bones that we think of in our body. When I say long bone, what are some of the bones that you think about in your body that are really long? I promise I'm not asking a trick question. This is as easy as it sounds. Yeah, so several of us pointing out my largest and longest bone in the body, that's the humerus, or the humerus, no. Dr. Ollis, drink more coffee. The largest and longest bone in the body is the femur. Another long bone, like several of us mentioned too, is the humerus. We can see a couple more long bones right here. If you use yourself as a guide, any idea what these bones are down here? Bones number 1 and 2. Can we tell what bones those would be? And you can feel them on yourself if that helps you to get a reference point. What bones do we have? The bones of your forearm, essentially, is what Dr. Ollis is asking. Yeah, exactly. So we can see the radius and the ulna. Those are another example of long bones. The tibia and the fibula that are down in your leg, those are long bones. So we've got several sets of long bones in our body that are really long. The femur, the radius and the ulna, the humerus. But any bone that is longer than it is wide, like these ones in the palm of your hand, these ones called the metacarpals, these are also considered long bones. They're longer than they are wide. Next to the metacarpals, we can see bones like this. This is one of my carpal bones, another carpal bone, that are about as wide as they are tall. If we're about as wide as we are tall, we're considered a short bone. So short bones, about as wide as they are tall. Hugh asked a good question about the sternum. When we talk about the sternum, that actually is another type of bone that we have in the body. The sternum is a type of bone that we call a flat bone. So if I have a bone that's taller than it is wide, but also it's really thin or really delicate, my name for that kind of bone is a flat bone. So I don't have any flat bones in the hand, but we do have one in the sternum, like Hugh mentioned. We also have one in the ribs as well. So the ribs are flat bones. The sternum is a flat bone if something's really skinny, and often it curves at the edge as well because it's so skinny. That's an example of flat bones. We also have a type of bone, again, that's not in my picture here, but a type of bone that I can't call it a long bone, I can't call it a short bone, can't call it a flat bone, it's just funky looking. For ones that I can't classify any other way, I'm just going to call those irregular bones. So irregular bones are bones that, as I like to say, they defy classification. They're not long, they're not short, they're not flat, they're a little bit of everything. So an example of that would be the scapula, your shoulder blade. And we'll look at another example here in just a moment. One more bone that we see right here. This kind of bone is not named based on its shape, but it's named based on its location. This is a bone called a sesamoid bone. And when we talk about sesamoid bones, we're talking about a bone that lives entirely inside a tendon. So sesamoid bones, I like to joke that this particular person, this must be an x-ray of someone who's a professional gamer. So they're constantly using their thumbs to get paid to play video games. That would be the life, right? So using their thumb a whole bunch, when you use something a lot, you can actually develop a little tiny bone inside your tendon. So we can see a sesamoid bone here. In reality, all of us have sesamoid bones everywhere. So the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet, we all have little sesamoid bones. They're different from person to person. Madison says she's got a little sesamoid bone like that too. That's awesome. So we all have sesamoid bones, different ones, small ones, but there's one big one that all of us have, and we find it in our knee. What might be the name of the bone, the sesamoid bone, that we find at our knee? Exactly. Yep, several of us chiming in. The biggest sesamoid bone in your body, the one that all of us have, is called the patella. So the patella is a sesamoid bone that develops inside the patellar tendon, that sesamoid bone for us. So with our description of these different types of bones, now we're going to look at some other examples of bones in the body, and we're going to see if we can classify those. This bone right here that we're looking at, do we have an idea of what bone this one might be? And I will admit, this one maybe is a little tricky. Any ideas what bone we can see up here? While we're thinking about the bone, Kaylee did ask a question about how we get those sesamoid bones. And yes, it's correct. If we're moving something a lot, if we're pulling on the tendon a lot, that will lead to the development of sesamoid bones. So that's why we get them mostly in the palms of the hands and the soles of our feet, because we use those tendons all the time. Yeah, so great question. It forms because of movement. Yeah, so this is the humerus. When we look at this bone, the way that we can tell that it's the humerus is because of this part up here. This part up here is called the head of the humerus. And when we look at the humerus, the head is really close to it. So I'm going to show you the femur in just a moment. The head is not really close to the femur. So the humerus was one of those bones. We already talked about its classification. Can you remind me in the chat, how would we classify the humerus bone? What kind of bone is the humerus? Exactly. Yep, several of us chiming in. The humerus is an example of a long bone. So the humerus, a long bone. I want to skip really fast. We'll go back to the others. Here is that femur. Where's my little pointer? There we go. Here's the femur. And again, like I mentioned, it's the head that helps you to know you're looking at the femur. See how the head sticks out here, where it doesn't stick out over here. That's the biggest difference when you're not seeing them in a skeleton. That's the biggest difference between the humerus and the femur. So both the humerus and the femur, they're both long bones. Interestingly, this one here is also a long bone. So this is a bone called Proximal Phalanx number 4. It's an example, kind of like I was telling you, not all long bones are really, really long. This bone, though, is taller than it is wide, which makes it a long bone. For the sake of the midterm exam, we just need to know that all of these finger bones are called phalanges. For the final exam, we're going to have to know how to name each of them. Now, the good news is, if we know the naming pattern, we can say the name of everyone. So we don't have to memorize their specific names because we can predict it. When we talk about the phalanges, your fingers have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. When I'm talking about the one that's out here, the one that makes up your fingertip, would I say that that one is proximal or distal when we're looking at your fingertip at the very end? Yeah, exactly. The fingertip at the very end is the distal phalanx. So the distal phalanx farther from the attachment point, the proximal phalanx closer to the attachment point, and the middle phalanx in here. The thumb actually only has a distal and a proximal phalanx. You have one less bone in your thumb, which is why the thumb looks a little bit shorter. So we figured out proximal, middle, or distal. We sorted that out. We know that these are all phalanges. The 4 comes from us counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you don't have to know proximal phalanx number 4 for the midterm, but now we're ready for that when we have to know it for the final. Proximal phalanx number 4, if you're wearing a ring on your ring finger, that's the bone that it's on top of. So a long bone, which happens to be the bone that your rings sit on top of. I am getting a notice that my internet might not be doing awesome. Can you all still hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, I got to notice I'm sitting up here in my office and it says bad network quality. Great. If I happen to pop out or if something happens, please let me know in the chat. And I will stop talking and I will give it a moment to catch up. So thank you. Yeah, power outages all over the place. So yeah, if you lose power and you lose our meeting, that's okay. I get it. It's not great weather today. Yeah, so Hugh asked a clarifying question that proximal phalanx number 4 is part of the finger. That is correct. Yep. Again, number 4 is the ring finger, and this is the lowest part or the part of the ring finger where a ring sits on top of. Yeah. So the next bone that I have up here on the screen, do we recognize this one? We actually talked about it already. This is a good example of a flat bone. Yeah, we talked about the femur. Who do we have next door to the femur? Who's this one here? Sorry, my pointer's off because I'm too busy drawing. Yeah, so this is an example of the sternum. This is a picture of the sternum. So the central breastbone, or the one that's in the middle of your chest. It's hard to see in my picture, but this does kind of curve. So it curves in at the top and at the bottom, like all my flat bones do. They kind of curve a little bit. This is the patella. The patella was an example of a bone that we classified based on its location, not based on its structure. Can you remind me in the chat, what classification did we give to the patella? What kind of bone was the patella? Yeah, the patella is a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bone, the one that's found inside a tendon. So my last kind of bone that I'll toss up here for us. This is a vertebrae, or a vertebra, excuse me. Vertebrae are a really good example of irregular bones because when I look at the vertebrae, I have this region right here that's about as wide as it is tall. Awesome. But then I also have this region that sticks out here that's really skinny, or it's like a flat bone. And then I don't even know what to talk about what's going on up here because there's too many different parts of this bone that look all funky. We would consider this an irregular bone. So last type of bone, the thoracic vertebrae, that's an irregular bone. When we, oh, and I missed one, I apologize. My last little one down here, this is one of my carpal bones. I told you that all of the carpals, I think I told you this, all of the carpals are the same classification. They're about as tall as they are wide. What's my classification word for a bone that's about as tall as it is wide? What's that last one we haven't talked about yet? Exactly. Yep, those short bones. So any of my carpals, and I'll mention any of my tarsals as well, any of the ankle bones are also short bones, about as tall as they are wide. Tarsals and carpals, best examples of short bones. Any questions about this before we look more specifically at our long bones? Or shoot me a thumbs up if you're tracking with me. I can't remember if it was lecture or lab on Monday, but I put out a call for questions or for emojis, and it was quiet for a really long time. And so I said, "Are you all sleeping on me? That's not fair." Then they woke up and sent me little emojis. So it was all good. No sleeping yet. We'll sleep later, right? We'll take a nice ice storm nap later. Hopefully. I like it, Madison. That's awesome. Dancing skeleton. Perfect. Okay, I want to look more specifically at our long bones. Because long bones are so long, we actually have special regions of them. So when we talk about long bones, there are some special parts that we need to be able to label, or special parts we need to be familiar with. So when we look at a long bone, The big, long middle part is something called the diaphysis. So the diaphysis of a long bone is the shaft of a long bone. That's what makes it look so long. So the big, long middle part of a long bone, the diaphysis. The two ends of a long bone are each called an epiphysis. They're each called an epiphysis. But I don't just call them an epiphysis. I don't just call them an end. I need to label them proximal and distal. So let me put some numbers. Number 1, number 2. Which one of those, 1 or 2, would be my proximal epiphysis? Any ideas? Yeah, so I have several votes for number 1, and that is accurate. Remember that proximal means we're closer to the attachment site. So the head of the femur that we're seeing up here, that is the most proximal thing on the femur. So the proximal epiphysis goes into the hip. This makes up part of my hip joint there. The distal epiphysis is what goes to the knee, the distal epiphysis. On the outside of a long bone, this is all we can label. But when we go inside the long bone, there's a few other things that we can label. So one of those things that we can label is this area here in the middle. This area here in the middle is the part of my long bone called the medullary cavity. Medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is an open space in the middle of your long bones. There's kind of two jobs of the medullary cavity. The first job is to make your bones not weigh as much. The second job is to have a space for red bone marrow. So we find bone marrow inside the medullary cavity, which is the open space in the diaphysis. The other thing we can see when we look at a cross section of a long bone is we can see the two types of bone tissue that are present. So I'm going to label them 1 and 2 here. When I'm looking at my epiphyses, when I'm looking at my ends of the bone, I can see little open spaces. I can see little spots. Which of my kinds of bone tissue has open spaces or has spots inside of that? Is that 1 or 2? Let's start with our numbers. Yeah, so bone tissue number 2 is what I see in here, but Dusty is totally right. Bone tissue number 2 is my spongy bone. Spongy bone. So in the ends of your long bones, in the epiphyses of your long bones, we have spongy bone tissue. Along the outside of our bone, especially when we're looking here in the shaft, but everywhere on the very outside of your bone, all of this is the compact bone. Compact bone. Goodness, that's a terrible number 1. Compact bone. That's what's lining the outside of your bones, all of the bones of your body, but it's very thick in the diaphysis. It's very thick in the shaft. So on all of my long bones, whether it's the long bones in your fingers, whether it's the long bones in your arms or your legs, all of those have these regions. We'll only ask you to identify them on a femur, but you be aware of the fact that this is something that all of my long bones have. All right. One more activity that I need to do with you before I split us up into our groups. So let's chat about the last activity that we're doing here today. Can you tell me which page number in your packet you have this picture and this one? Which page do we have the femur and the skull? Page number 4. Awesome. Okay. Here's what I need you to write across the top of page number 4. In big, bold letters, capital letters, we need to write, do not memorize this. Do not memorize this. I promise you, on the lab midterm exam, I am not going to ask you, where do I find the greater trochanter of the femur? I promise I'm not going to ask you that. What I am going to ask you is what this word trochanter means. I'm going to ask you, does that mean something that sticks out? Does that mean something that's an indentation? Does that mean a hole? So page 4, we're writing that note, do not memorize, right? If you go to page 5 has the kinds of things you are memorizing. So on page 5, you've got the lists that we see here. We're going to work on filling this in together. So we're going to need to memorize for the midterm exam, which of my fancy bone marking words means a hole? Which of my bone marking words means an indentation or something that's pressed down? Which of my words means something that is an edge? So kind of toward the outside of something. And then notice we've got a bunch of words that are going to be some kind of projection, something that sticks up. What we need to do for the midterm exam is we need to have memorized that this word tuberosity means something that sticks up, and that this word tubercle means something that sticks up, and that this word fissure means a hole. Because what I'm going to have you do on the midterm exam is I'm going to give you the name of a bone marking that you've never seen before. It's not going to be one of these like we're labeling here. It's going to be a new one, but it's going to use the same words that these ones use. So maybe we're going to look for a bone marking that is a condyle. Maybe we're going to look for something that's a trochanter. We're going to look for something that's on your word list. And as long as you know that, oh, this word means a hole, or this word means a projection, as long as you know that, you can answer that question. You can apply what you know to answer that question. So I'm going to work with you together. We're going to fill in the femur, the bone markings of the femur, because I want to show you how to use what you're labeling to fill in the list on page 5. We will not get page 5 completely filled in during our class time today. We're not going to have time for that. But you'll finish filling it in using the skull picture. So we're not going to label skull stuff today. We're going to label femur stuff today. Label the skull stuff at home to use it to help you fill in those lists. So let's work on this together. I think once we start doing it, it'll seem a lot less scary than it just sounded when I talked about it way too long. All right, let's start at the part of my femur up here, because we've already talked about this part before. Can you remind me in the chat, what is the name of this part of the femur? Do you happen to remember what I told you, what part sticks out really far? It's on my list over here too. Here's all the markings we'll be labeling. Yeah, exactly. A couple of us chiming in. This is the part of the femur that's called the head. So the head of the femur, now that I've got its technical name, which isn't too bad, that's not too scary, I go over to the labeled one with the easy words. Notice that on the labeled easy words one, it says that this kind of bone marking is a projection. Okay, so this word head is a projection. I go over to page 5 and I say, hey, look, one word that means a projection is a head. The head of the femur, the head of the humerus, the head of the radius. All of these are a projection. There's something that sticks out. Okay, one bone marking down, several to go. When I look at the femur, I have 2 bumps. See how I'm calling these things bumps? A larger one and a smaller one. I'm going to help us out. These bumps are called trochanters. Do we think that it's the greater trochanter or the lesser trochanter that's the bigger one? That's the larger one. Do you think greater or lesser is going to be bigger? Promise it's not a trick question. Exactly. Yep, several of us chiming in. This big bump up here is the greater trochanter. This smaller one over here, still a bump, the lesser trochanter. Awesome. I really can't write. Apologies. Notice that we've got a line that's in between the bumps. This line in between the bumps right here, it's in between the trochanters. This is called the Intertrochanteric Crest. Intertrochanteric Crest. We have found a word that means a line and a word that means a bump. Trochanter and crest. Let's go back to page 5. A bump, we discovered, is a trochanter. And a line, we discovered, was that word crest. Crest. See how we're taking our fancy anatomy words and we're turning them into easy words. We know that all of these means things that stick up. Let's do the other end. Let's do the distal end of the femur. When I look at the distal end of the femur, I have 2 bumps that are called condyles and 2 bumps that are called epicondyles. If I told you that the head of the femur is the part of the femur that goes into your hip joint, would we say that the head of the femur is on the lateral side or the medial side? If the head of the femur is what goes into the hip joint, is that lateral or medial? Yeah, several of us are agreeing. The head of the femur is on the medial side, which means that this over here is going to be medial and this over here is going to be medial. That's going to make these ones over here lateral because they're not on the medial side. Now we've got bumps. We've got one that's just called the outer bump. We've got another one that's called the outer above bump. Well, remember that the epidermis was above the dermis. So my above bumps are the epicondyles. Epicondyles. My bumps that are down below are the condyles. I'm glad you all are hearing me say this because, man, my writing is terrible today. So sorry. The only thing that we have left then is this indentation right here. See how it's an indentation? And it's an indentation that's between, this between thing always means inter, in between those 2 bumps that we just talked about. The intercondylar fossa, the indentation between the condyles, the intercondylar fossa. So we got some new words to add. We need to add fossa, we need to add condyle, and epicondyle. When we talked about the fossa, we said that that was an indentation. It was in between my bumps. So anytime you see the word fossa, it always means an indentation, something that's going down. When we talked about those bumps, remember that that was the words condyle and epicondyle. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to write the whole word. So what do we have left to do that we need to do to help us finish up this lab packet? We need to label the specific bone markings of the skull that are listed on there so that we can sort out the words we have left. We have already sorted the word condyle. We've already talked about crests and epicondyles. We talked about a fossa, the head, the trochanter. We have 4 words left that we need to sort onto our lists. And the way you're going to know how to sort them, whether they're a projection or a hole or an edge, The way you're going to know how to do that is by labeling the bone markings on the skull and then checking out what word is in bold. Here's an edge word, here's a projection word, here's a whole word. So use that to help you complete your list. Then memorize those lists on page 5. I was telling students earlier this week, you know that a lot of anatomy stuff isn't awesome for flashcards, but this stuff is awesome for flashcards. Front side of my flashcard says, what kind of bone marking is a fissure? Backside says it's a hole. Front side of my note card says, what kind of bone marking is a fossa? Backside says an indentation. Or front side says, what kind of bone marking is a trochanter? It's a projection. We need to start grouping these things together in our mind to prepare us for going into all of the different bone markings that we'll be talking about in the second half of the semester. On today's group work assignment, there is a question that's just like the kinds of questions that you'll see on the midterm exam, where I give you a picture of a bone with different bone markings labeled, and I ask you which of these bone markings represents, we'll do one here, which of these bone markings would represent the greater trochanter? Or which of these bone markings would represent the intercondylar fossa? If you know what the word fossa means, or if you know what the word trochanter means, you can use clues to get to the right bone marking. So we'll do that as the last question on our group work assignment to get us practicing making these kinds of predictions. Before I split us up into groups, do we have any last minute questions about any of the content from lesson number 6 or about that midterm exam next week? All right, well, my chat has gone silent, so I'm going to go ahead and end my recording, and then I'll pop up that group work form for you.